One pawn, no other piece, and it is stronger than even a rook. This is the passed pawn, the single most important asset in chess endgames. So what makes a passed pawn dangerous? A passed pawn is a pawn with no enemy pawns in front of it on its own on a single file, and there are no other pawns at the adjacent file as well. So in this particular position you are looking at, this pawn on b5 is a pass pawn. There is no black pawn in all of this file. There is no black pawn in any of the c6 or a6 diagonal. So that particular pawn is a pass pawn. So it has a very clear path all the way to the other side of the board. And if it reaches the end of the board or the other side of the board, it becomes a queen. This is why a pass pawn is so powerful. It is a potential queen or a future queen. Every square it advances, its value grows. On the seventh rank, a pass pawn is nearly as valuable as a real queen itself, because one move and it is going to be the queen. So if this pawn keep pushing, the value from just a single point starts to increase, and when it eventually gets to this point here, it becomes a very powerful piece. Even on the seventh rank, a pass pawn on the seventh rank is as valuable as the queen, because a single move can make it become a queen. So your opponent is forced to spend all of its resources to stop this pawn from getting to the end of the board. If they use their king to block it, there's their king is not defending anywhere else. They have to focus on the pawn. If they use their rook or a bishop to stop it, those pieces are passive and they won't be able to attack any other thing than to guard the pass pawn. The pass pawn does not need to promote to be powerful. You simply pushing the pass pawn to maybe the seventh rank, or the ability to push it forward by advancing or by demanding attention, is going to divert all of your opponent pieces and create opportunities for all your own other pieces to win material. One of the most strategic concepts in pawn endgames is the outside pass pawn. So let's take a look at this particular position here. If you have an outside pass pawn, or if you have a pawn on one side of the board and pawns or several pawns at the other side, the pass pawn that you have at one side of the board can be used as a decoy. So you advance that pawn, that single pawn, and direct your opponent kings to that side. So your opponent must chase after the pawn. While your opponent is chasing the pawn, you then have the opportunity to use your own king and your other pawns at the other side to advance to the end of the board, and then you capture all of the undefended pawns from your opponent's side. And when this happens, you have what we call the outside pass pawn, which has been used as a decoy. So take a look at these beautiful positions here. This is the pawn endgame, and it is white's turn to play. You can see now that white eventually did something. Black has the majority, right? Black has the pawn majority at the queen side with a lot, or at the king side rather, with a lot of pawns, 4 pawns compared to 3 pawns. So right, so but white has the pawn majority here. So and that is exactly what white used. Because of this pass pawn, white used it as a decoy to prevent black from catering for these 4 pawns at this other side. So 4 against 3 at the king side, and you see that black is not able to guard these pawns. Instead, he played king to c6. Reason being because of this pawn. If he eventually gets promoted, and then all of this will become useless. So black has to cater for it. So this is what white used as a decoy. Immediately, white pushed the pawn forward, and then white, sacrificed this bishop in order to gain an advantage and get closer to these other pawns there. And eventually, that is what white did. Push this king to this side, capture all of the pawns, and then have the opportunity to direct its own pawn to the end of the board. So this concept, the outside pass pawn, is a distraction. The pawn served as a distraction, and then it has determined a lot of end games, right? So players who understand an outside pass pawn or wins almost all the time. So the player who does not know how to use an outside pass pawn will eventually lose, and then they'll be wondering what exactly happened. So the next thing we are going to talk about is the pass pawn or the protected pass pawn. So a pass pawn is dangerous, right? But a protected pass pawn defended by another pawn is almost winning in the end game. So a protected pass pawn on the fifth, sixth, or seventh rank is almost impossible to stop. Let's take a look at this particular position. This is a pass pawn ready to be promoted, and here you have a protected pass pawn because it is protected by another pawn, and your opponent cannot capture it because they are protected um by another pawn, because when they capture it, there is another pawn ready to get it captured back. They cannot easily block it as well, right? So it's like you holding down a piece using your other piece. The blockading piece is only going to be tied down permanently, and you have your king and other pieces free to create a threat, right? So most of the time, you can use it as a blockading piece as well, and you have your king and other pieces free. They can create threats elsewhere and do some damages. So the practical rule is that if you get a protected pass pawn in the end game, advance it immediately. Use your king to escort it, and every move it advances puts pressure on your opponent, right? So if you look at this position here, you are ready to advance, but because it is protected, you don't need to be really bothered about these 2 pawns. What you need to focus on is moving your king and then getting your opponent pieces captured, right? So when you capture your opponent pieces like this, you are ready to like advance your own pieces, and then you get your opponent checkmated eventually. So the question is, how do you create a pass pawn? There are three different methods to create a pass pawn. One of them is what we call a pawn majority. I was showing us a particular pawn majority game just now, where your opponent has 4 pawns and you have 3 pawns. Most of the time, if not for the outside pawn which black used to distract the opponent's king, it might be impossible for black to win that endgame position because white already has the pawn majority. So if you have 3 pawns against 2 pawns on one side, you should advance those pawns, and then 3 overwhelming pawns against 2, you will eventually create a pass pawn, and then one of the pawns is going to eventually get checkmated. One of the pawns is going to eventually get promoted. So I'm trying to show us a particular example of a pass pawn or a pawn majority, which eventually creates a pass pawn. So let's take a look at this particular position here. So you have white king ready to move around, and then when you eventually move, you are able to capture one of the pawns here. Now look at this side, you have 2 pawns against 1 pawn. It is easy to create a pass pawn based on this protected pawn, and then when you move your king to one side, you are ready to get promoted, and then after a move like this, you can move around and then you push your pawns eventually, and the pawn gets promoted to a queen. So the second way to create a pass pawn, or the second method to create a pass pawn, is a pawn break. You have to find a way to advance your pawn that forces your opponent to recapture, right? So find a pawn that a pawn advance that is going to force your opponent to capture back, and when they capture, you eliminate the pawn that was blocking your own future pawn, right? So most of the time when you look at our past video where we talked about the different forms of pawns, right? We talk about the pawn structure and pawn break, right? So you can watch our video if you have not seen about the pawn break. So you have to push a particular pawn in order for your opponent to capture and create a pass pawn for your own piece, right? So this is another method. Then the third method is piece activity first, right? So sometimes you need to win a pawn first. You have to use your tactics. You need to, pin, forks, discovered attacks, which we talked about, and then some other methods. Sometimes you have to create an imbalance. Most of these imbalances happen in the beginning of the game. That is why it is important to protect almost all of your pieces, even if it is a pawn. So a lot of gambits that are out there, you have to be careful on which one to use, because if you are playing against a very strong player, it is impossible for you to hold on to this gambit when you have lost, even if it is a pawn, because your opponent is going to use this imbalance throughout the end of the game and you might not recover back that pawn. So if you are able to use, or if you are a strong player as well, if you become a strong player and your opponent is using a tactics against you where they eventually lose a pawn, you can hold that position or use that imbalance to use what we call the pawn majorities at any side of the board in which that pawn was captured. And then you know that you definitely have more pawns at that side than your opponent, and you can eventually create a pass pawn in the end game. So in every end game, ask yourself where you can create a passed pawn. That is often the key, the key questions that decide how the game is going to go. In the end game, almost all of your pieces don't matter because they have been exchanged off the board. Your pawns become the gods, and when you are able to push your pawn to the end of the board, you've created a very dangerous end game, and your opponent might most likely not be able to hold it, and eventually you checkmate. The passed pawn, a pawn with no enemy pawns blocking its path. It is a future queen. Its power grows with every single square that you advance. The protected pass pawn is nearly always winning, and the outside pawn diverts the enemy king. Create pass pawns, advance them, and your end game will improve dramatically. Tomorrow is an intermediate puzzle day. Yay. And then next time we learn how to read the chessboard. Talking about ranks, files, diagonals, or you've seated with a lot of chess players who are talking about reading the chessboard, but you don't really know how to do that yourself as a chess player. So this is a foundational lesson for young players. Any young players who wants to follow chess notations, or you want to be able to read a chessboard when a game is ongoing, subscribe and I will see you then. Bye.